Hello everyone, welcome into Above My Pay Grade. My name is Eric. Now, I want to do another story about the military today. Now, if you're in the military or you pay taxes, that's all of you. This story applies to you. The health of the military is in doubt. I'm a person who spent a significant time in the military, and so this is important to me. And if you're a citizen, I think it should be important to you. So you should know what's going on in the military, how they're being treated, what your taxpayer dollars are going to, etc. Now, I'm going to link this story in the description below, but the title of it is Survey Raises Serious Questions About the Future of an All-Volunteer Force. As you know, the military only takes volunteers today, and that number is dwindling. We're going to dig into why. So, there was a military family readiness survey that went through the force, and they had about 10,000 participants in the survey, and they asked all kinds of questions related to their military experience, whether they would recommend it for their kids, that kind of stuff. Quote from the article, fewer military veterans and spouses are likely to recommend military service according to the findings, and the reasons are related to their own well-being, said Shannon Resden, President and Executive Director of Military Family Advisory Network, who did the survey. At the end of the day, families are having a hard time making ends meet. We all know what's been going on with inflation. And if you don't know, military pay raises are typically based off of private sector pay raises. So they don't raise with inflation like Social Security does. So if inflation's at 8 and the private sector job or their pay went up by 5%, that's what military pay is going to go up. Now, I will say the way the military calculates this pay raise is a bureaucratic nightmare, and it lends towards underpay. I'll just say that. Not paying people commensurate with the purchasing power they're trying to give them. It does not keep up. Like I said, hard time making ends meet, and that's affecting their overall well-being. We see connection between well-being and loneliness, well-being and housing, well-being and food security for your military. When you layer that on top of the fact that fewer people are likely to recommend military service. Now, a fairly large tradition in the military is, and if you ask anybody, did your dad serve, did your mom serve, etc., there's a tradition of military service throughout the family. Now, what happens when that tradition's broken? When the next guy goes, I'm not recommending this to my kids, what happens to the pool of applicants in the military? Obviously, it dwindles. Now, why are people in the military currently not going to recommend it in the future? Let's go down the line here. So, in 2019, 74.5% of respondents, when asked, will you recommend the military to your kids? 74.5% said yes. And today, that was in 2019. And today, 2 years later, only 62.9%. So it dropped by about 5%, which is fairly significant. Now, a lot of people look at these kind of numbers and these kind of issues and say, it's not that huge of a deal. When they compound on themselves over years, it becomes a massively huge deal. Think about military pay that doesn't keep up with inflation. Last year, the military got around a 2.5% raise, and inflation was 6%. And now it's about 9%. 9 plus 6 is 15. So military families are dealing with quite the pay cut, and most military families don't make a ton of money. That becomes a massive issue. And I'll talk specifically down in the article here about things that the military faces that your average civilian does not. In general, over the years, a number of military children had followed in the footsteps of their parents. But there are indications that those trends are waning. Again, these compound on each other. Over a decade, this can be a massively huge issue for an all-volunteer force. Military Family Association report that pointed to the root cause of many problems in the military families that have been understood for years, the military move. This is the part that a lot of civilians don't have to face. Let's say you're a family in North Carolina in the military, and life is good, you're living on base, etc., and you get orders to California. You do not have an option to not take those. Military, it's in the word, ordered you to go to California. So off you go to California with your whole family. You get to the base, you try to get into the military housing. There's a certain amount of military housing on base, and it's full. So you go on the open market, you realize there's nothing to buy. Everything you're trying to buy, you're getting outbid on top of the fact that rent is way above your allowance for housing. So the military, every location gives you a certain allowance for housing, and it has not kept up with the rent prices. Again, it's a bureaucratic organization, right? So in order for it to move dynamically and fluidly, it's impossibility. So now this family who moved from North Carolina to California is faced with the proposition of coming out of pocket and spending up to 50% or more of their money on just housing, just getting a place to rent. And so they're forced to lower their standards, maybe live in the part of town that you shouldn't be living in as a military member. That's a problem. And again, they don't have the choice. Your average person would just say, I'm not moving there. I'm not going to do that. But in the military, they don't have the choice. So all of a sudden, they're in this new place. They can't afford the rent. The housing allowance hasn't kept up. And they're in a lot of trouble. Okay. Is the military doing anything to fix it? Not really. Okay. Reading on. In 2021, those who had recently experienced permanent change of station, we call that PCS in the military, reported a negative or very negative experience with reimbursement of moving costs, because a lot of times they have to front that moving cost, then the military pays them back. Again, bureaucracy. And getting that payment back has been kind of difficult. On top of the fact, let's say you're a couple who has kids and your spouse works as well. That spouse has to go to the employer and say, hey, look, yeah, I don't know how long you're going to be able to retain me because my husband or wife is in the military and we move every so often. A lot of employers don't want to hire those people, or they might, but it makes it very hard for the spouse to retain employment, which makes the living cost, or the burden of the living costs, go up. All right, further reading. This is the wild thing, and this has happened mainly in the last 2 years, the burden of housing costs. And this is such a massive deal, and those who think it's not and tell people, why don't you just save more money? Again, that's an unsat answer. A lot of young people in the military who want to serve, who want to have a family, are realizing it's very hard to do both because the military is not paying them enough. And so they get out. So if the military wants to retain people, you need to pay them more. But here's the burden of housing that has specifically happened in the last few years. The survey provided more data on the impact of rising housing costs. Nearly half of those surveyed, 45%, of currently serving military families experience severe housing burden like the one I just talked about, spending more than 50 of their household income on housing costs, such as mortgage, rent, and utilities. That is a rising tide that you cannot keep up with. If you are spending 50% of your income on housing costs alone, you're in poverty land. You're in poverty land. And again, they don't have a choice when they move. They do not have a choice. And a lot of families are trying to get on base. And on base, housing has a fixed cost based off your housing allowance. But as these housing costs in these jurisdictions goes up like this to the moon, as a lot of you have experienced, this is how the housing allowance keeps up. They do a survey, they talk to people, and a year later it comes out and they raise it by 2%, when the housing costs have really raised by 20%. And so compounding on itself each year, if that delta between what housing costs actually cost and how much of housing allowance is actually going up, if that keeps compounding year over year, if the difference in 1 year is 20% and the next year is 20%, that's 40%. That's a ton of money. And So they have two choices. They try to live on base, which there's typically a wait list, or they go off base. And if they want to be fiscally responsible and pay what is in their housing allowance, they have to go to cell block A in the crappiest part of town to actually get a house. A lot of people with kids, that's not really palatable, okay? So there's a person like this who's faced with the decision of living in a crappy part of town, and if this persists, they'll leave. They're gonna leave. And you can say needs of the military and all that kind of stuff, which a lot of people say. But the needs of the military are readiness. And I've said this over and over again. If you're a civilian, everything in the military is based off of readiness. So we have different areas of responsibility based off what unit you're in. And their readiness is a posture, if you will. So if you have 1,000 troops, are they able to execute this mission if China does X, Y, and Z? Are they ready to do it? That's why we call it readiness. And a lot of readiness has to do with your personal life. And if your financial well-being is in the toilet, how ready do you think people are going to be? If they have the stress of not being able to feed their kids, how focused on the mission do you think people are going to be? Not so focused, okay? So when we talk about needs of the military is readiness. And if your people can't feed their kids, that's makes them unready. Last couple things here. In 2021, 1 in 6, or 16% of military veterans' families experienced food insecurity and hunger. Now, there's two sides of this coin. There are some people in the military who do not have strong financial habits. Okay, go buy a brand new truck at 16% interest rate kind of deal. But I'm mainly thinking about those with families, okay? Young soldiers and airmen, Marines who have families, want to serve their country, and they can't feed their family with what they're doing. And they're in their first contract, and they realize, the military keeps digging a hole, and I can't get out of it because the difference between my pay and inflation keeps getting bigger. And so this problem's going to get worse. So what is this person supposed to do? They're going to get out, is what they're going to do, which affects readiness and affects the all-volunteer force. Again, this problem plays out over decades. But if the military doesn't nip this in the bud, a lot of, I can guarantee you, a lot of the surveys done to raise housing costs and to raise pay, they all have to do with, well, this is transitory. We don't want to raise pay and then that's set in stone and then inflation goes back down. We don't want to experience that. We don't want to raise military pay and then deflation happens, right? So they're waiting for it to go back down. It's not going back down. It's not. It's going higher and higher. And projected in 2023 for military is a pay raise of I think it's almost 5%, which is a fairly large pay raise if you don't look at inflation. We just saw a 9% inflation print. So it was about 2.5% when inflation was at 6%. By the way, that's government advertised inflation. It's way higher than that. But if the pay raise is at, let's just say for ease of figuring, 3 for 2022, and inflation was at 6, you lost 3% of your pay. Now, they want to raise it about 5 when inflation's at 9. So that's 4% of your pay for a total of 7. So now you've lost 7% of your pay when you don't even make that much to begin with, and housing costs are going through the roof. You can see the problem. If you serve in the military or have served in the military, let me know what the truth is on the ground where you live. What are housing costs? How are you able to afford it? And the last thing I'll say, and this is another problem that's going to go, it's going to come in the next decade or so. If housing crashes, when these military families were forced to do something when they moved, they were forced to buy a house because they couldn't afford anything else. They couldn't live on base. They couldn't find a place to rent. They were forced to buy. What if housing crashes? What do you think is going to happen to their security if housing crashes? Because, again, unique to the military, This family is forced to move. It's forced to move. So a lot of people are like, if I can afford the payment, even if it crashes, I'm good. They have to move. So they have to sell or rent it out. And if they can't rent it out for their mortgage payment and they're forced to sell at a loss, you can see the problem there. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. See you guys in the next one. Peace.